Hi, and welcome back to the History Hut as we continue our discussion of the Northwest Rebellion. So what was it that the Métis wanted from the government?
Well, they wanted their rights to these new lands to be recognized, I think, mostly.
Seems fair.
Yeah, they were just like, they wanted title or patents to the land that they were actually on. But of course, it's the same as it was in 1869. The government said, quite sensibly, I suppose, we can't do that until the surveys have completed. So we have to complete some surveys. And of course, the Métis are like, no, these parts, this is my land and it's okay. You don't have to survey. So for the meantime, they were considered to be squatters on the land until the government goes in and does its thing. They didn't want the English square-style lots again. They wanted the traditional Métis and before that French-Canadian seigneurial lots, the river lots. And they wanted really the deal that they had been given in Manitoba. So they wanted that, 1.4 million acres of land, or, enough land per family to actually be able to make a go of things. And the government response was really non-existent. Between 1878 and 1884, the Métis sent petitions to the east, but the only real response from the government was to tell, not the Métis, but to tell the Surveyor General to respect Métis river lots whenever they were there in strength. So in other words, if you ended up going there before all the men left for the hunt, then you were like, okay, I'll just survey it as a rectangle, that's fine. But if you got there after they'd left, you're like, okay, we'll do it the proper way. So not really, telling the Métis what it is they're up to. Everybody's kind of uncertain again about this whole thing. So the surveys are undertaken while the families are away on the hunt, and the old rules were to be applied. Only lots that had been improved would be considered possibly sometime in the future for a land grant. So of course there's great unease with this. And then by early 1885, just to skip ahead a little, by early 1885, and prompted by the arrival of Louis Riel, the government said that it would investigate some of the claims, so not even all of the claims, but some of the claims, and a few families would be allowed to hold their lands in the old way. So then it's just a case of, it's not going to be a fair deal for everybody. Who is it you're going to pick?
Yeah.
Right? So by this time, there were about 300 Métis families, so that's about 1,400 people, and they're at the forks of the Métis River that we all know and love, making up about half the population. So they're really just asking, you've got 300 families asking for land title and some assistance, and the Territorial Council thought that this was sensible, but the government under John A Macdonald, who's his own Minister of the Interior, you'll remember, didn't really want to rush into anything. To be fair to him, he saw problems with the original settlement, and so, he's worried about just responding in the same way. So, so they send the petitions, and then I guess you'd say,
Yeah, so why no response, or why weren't
exactly,
the grievances addressed?
Why no response? Well, remember that there had been a Liberal government in power from 1874 to 1878, and then you have Macdonald coming back in 1878, which is the same year that the petitions really begin, that people start to worry. And he is Minister of the Interior. The country's in the throes of a depression that's a worldwide depression. And he thought, as I've said a few times now, he thought that any threat to the national policy would probably come from native people, that it wouldn't come from the Métis, who are considered a separate group of people and not considered Aboriginal people until the Charter in 1982. So, insofar as the government was concerned at all about the Métis petitions, they were hesitant to act. Macdonald's position was that the Manitoba Act had really been a failure when it came to settling of the land claims. Otherwise, people would have stayed and it would have been okay. So it had been a failure, and to repeat it just by handing out land scripts would be kind of stupid, that maybe there were some alternatives. But, he takes his time with the alternatives. So he said, he wants to explore other options, and he didn't think it was that vital a matter. So of course that's why you get the delay, because there's no sense of urgency. And probably another thing I should point out is that the Northwest Territory is, governed by Ottawa as a colony with a lieutenant governor and a council. It's responsible to the Minister of the Interior. There are no MPs, there are no senators, so it's not like it's going to be a vote loser if you don't react. So and of course people, the Métis in particular, and then the group that are the delegation that go to find Louis Riel, they really don't get on very well with Edgar Dewdney at all, and so they feel like maybe he's either not passing things on or he's changing the story and downplaying it. So so back to Macdonald, he reasoned that because so many Métis in Manitoba had either sold the land scrip or had been, bilked out of their land, that this wouldn't be a beneficial resettlement. So he thought of some alternatives like making treaties or non-negotiable scrips. But in the end, it's like about a 6-year period, and Flanagan says, well, that's just a little delay while the government sorted itself out. But really the response comes only once Louis Riel's back, and then the definite response comes when violence breaks out. So it's just like wait till the last minute. And in the meantime, as I mentioned before, the Métis are joined by the other settlers in their growing sense of frustration, that kind of benign neglect. Nobody's really bothered about them at all. So the causes of the rebellion, I think, are directly traced back to the relationship between the people of the Northwest Territory and Ottawa, and just this well, we don't really think it's all that important. And of course, again, nobody having the vote in the Northwest, so there's nobody to really represent you or to bring your case up. And you have quite a few leaders. Alexander Morris, who'd been a treaty commissioner, was lieutenant governor, and then he's followed by David Laird, who was a treaty commissioner and then lieutenant governor, and then you get Edgar Dewdney. And it's quite clear from Edgar Dewdney's writings that he has very little use for the Métis and just doesn't kind of rate them at all. And this is in the period where I think earlier in the century people said, Native people, they are savage. The Métis have the best of both worlds. And by the time you get to this period, it's like, no, Native people are great. The Métis are just, miles below that. So a change in attitudes as well. And he's not all that bothered about the settlers either, to be fair to him. He's just annoying to everybody. So that's why the delegation plans strategies to try and bypass Dewdney and get the ear of the government. And then the government is really unresponsive. So, what do you do? What do you keep doing until somebody says, yeah, you've really got a problem? I'd like to be the one to sort that out. So by 1885, you've got this explosive mix in the cradle of the West. You've got some native chiefs who are really unhappy and want to renegotiate treaty. You've got the Métis who are feeling really frustrated and ignored. You've got settlers who are unhappy, and the Métis begin to look back to the glory days when they were actually able to stand up to the government and get a good deal out of the government. And they couldn't help but think of their old leader, Louis Riel. And so both the Canadian settlers and the Métis out west decided that it was time to find him and ask if he could perhaps help them just one more time. So this is the kind of thing, look for him.
What had he been up to in this time?
He had a story.
I can tell by your expression there. He was up to something.
Such an interesting guy. Where was he? Who knew? He was a school teacher in the Old Sun Reserve in Montana, so he had been all over the place by this time. He was a respectable married man with a Métis wife and 2 little children. He had also given up his status as a subject of Queen Victoria, and he had become an American citizen, which raises all sorts of other interesting questions about his fate at the hands of Canadian justice, because he's actually an American citizen. The American government didn't recognize the designation Métis, and they called the Métis the landless Cree, and so he's part of the landless Cree out in in Montana, and this is actually an issue as well at the time of his trial. Oh, I'm telling too much. Bad things are going to happen. So in July of 1884, a delegation appeared at his doorstep. Here he's just, like 2 and 2 are 4, 3 and 3 are 6, just, having a regular old life. And they asked him to return and lead them in their negotiations with the government. They're like, this is what's happened to us. Can you come back and do it to me one more time? Can you do it to us? Do it for us? And he thought about it, and because he was by this time deeply religious, he saw this not just as a practical political matter, but he seemed to see it as God's call to him, and he had already started to think of the Métis as God's chosen people. And so there's a whole other dynamic going on. So he's deeply religious. He sees himself as a prophet. At one point, he tells someone that he's not actually Louis Riel. He's Louis Riel's twin David from Marseille. And there's like this whole other kind of thing going on in the background. So because he had this religious mission, and he had the ability and the chutzpah to do the petitions, he agrees to come back. And so that's interesting. He accepts and he comes back. But since we had last seen him, he had led a checkered existence. He had escaped or fled from Red River before the Wolseley expedition arrived in the summer of 1870, you'll remember. In 1872, he had been put up as MP for Provencher, and he had actually shown up at the House of Commons and signed in and everything, even though there was that $5,000 dead or alive on his head. And then he crossed the border into America, and he's really interesting career there. He's active in politics in Washington, D.C., and he supported, of course, they usually use the term Indian, so he supported Indian rights there, and he almost got an audience with the president. But at the same time that he's politically active, and he's actually introduced to all sorts of people in Washington, and they all speak very highly of him, say, he's so committed, and his eyes just light up when you talk about politics, when you talk about religion. So at the same time that he's doing that, he also begins to have visions. So he starts to have, I think 1875, he's visited by a spirit in a burning cloud. And if you were good at your gospels and stuff, you'd realize the relevance of that. So the spirit in the burning cloud told him that he would be God's instrument to lead the lost tribes of Israel. That would be the Métis. And his story then was that the Métis were a people who had crossed from Palestine to the Mediterranean and then over the Atlantic and found themselves at Red River. So a different kind of story. And they had bided their time, but now he saw the forces of Catholicism disintegrating, and he thought that Rome and the Pope had fallen under an evil influence, and Riel had been chosen to rejuvenate the church. And, you might think, oh, that sounds really crazy, but there are all sorts of other people in America at the same time doing the same kind of thing. There's all sorts of people seeing, the kind of apocalyptic end of the world and the forces of the church collapsing and the need for a new Jerusalem and all that kind of thing. So he's actually kind of part of an actual, not a religious movement, but a movement of people who all started to feel the same way as him. Yeah. So he's
religious.
Yeah, he's
not a religious movement, but a movement of religious people.
Religious people, of all sorts of different brands.
Varying.
So he thought that Rome would give way to Manitoba and the Northwest Territory. That he should offer the papal throne to Bishop Bourget of Montreal, who said, "No, thank you, that's fine. I'm okay with the Pope I have." And he saw himself as a kind of John the Baptist figure. And as soon as he started talking to his friends about all of this, they of course feared for his sanity, because there's all sorts of people that think they're reborn as Napoleon or Jesus or prophets of all sorts. So they, along with his uncle, they had him secretly brought back to Quebec, which of course is in Canada and where he's wanted, but he's brought back to Quebec, and he spent the next 18 months in a mental asylum at Longueuil Pointe, and then another one at Beauport, where he was cared for by the nuns. In fact, they moved him to the Beauport one because the nuns were worried that the Orange Order would find out that he was back in Canada, and they might, try and snatch him. And he was worried that he would be assassinated. So he thought that, if he was a real prophet and that maybe people would be out to kind of get him. So his friends just kind of said to him, because he would have like these, I think in Washington, he was at Mass on a Sunday, and he just had this sense that God was with him and just cried out with joy. And you see a lot of this stuff amongst saints as well, kind of 14th century stuff, where people are like, oh, and the light of God came upon me. And who are we, secular people that we are, to say that didn't happen and that wasn't real? Well, we can say it, but we might not be.
Yeah.
It might be right. It's hard in a secular world to imagine religion having that kind of impact, but it certainly did. So his friends said, you're making a fool of yourself. You're on trains, you're out in public, you're howling with joy. If you stop that, and if you just stop telling people, like the doctors, that you're hearing visions and you're having visions and you're hearing voices, then you'll probably get out. So finally he listened and got out, and he received an amnesty from the government in 1875 that kicked in 1880. And this is actually a period when he has the mental problems. And one of the arguments by Olive Knox is that he's just so depressed when he finds out in 1875 he's waiting for the amnesty. He thinks it's going to be right away, and when he finds out he's going to have to wait a few more years, he just has this. And he had actually had some kind of breakdown before in the 1860s when his father had died. He became really depressed and really religious at the same time. So maybe a few things of that sort had happened. So after leaving the asylum, he headed back to America, did some journalism, a bit like yourself. I was a bit of a political activist, and he actually, by 1879, he was en route to Montana with a whole group of other Métis families and Métis hunters. They had been in the Great Lakes area, and they'd been kind of pushed west by the American government, and so he decides to go with them. So he's politically active. Now you'll remember this from last time. He was politically active, and he tried to intervene in the whiskey trade out of Fort Benton, because remember we've been talking about the independent traders, the Fort Benton guys, the terrible whiskey trade. So he's in Montana, so he actually tries to intervene, and he writes about it and how terrible it is. He wrote to the newspapers on the what used to be called the half-breed question. That would be the Métis. So, he really involved that way. Married a Métis girl born in Montana, whose father had moved to Montana to follow the buffalo. She was quite young. I think she's about 20. And they got married, and they had 2 kids. And this is where, he settles to teaching in this boys' school on, alternately kind of reserve land, but it's really a Métis colony as well. And it's a shame because his wife dies shortly after he does, and then his daughter dies a few years after that of tuberculosis, I think, and then his son dies just after the turn of the century, so that kind of part of his line gets wiped out. So anyway, he gets his amnesty from the government, goes back to America, renounces his allegiance to the Queen, and becomes a U.S. citizen in 1883. And then here we are in 1884, only a year later, still very active in Native causes and Métis causes, and he's approached by this delegation from the Northwest to come back and to help. So how could he refuse? He does come, and he does try to lead the negotiations, and on the other side of his character, he also thought that he was a prophet, right? Scholars like Tom Flanagan point out that Riel felt that the government owed him big time for having run the Provisional Government, never been kind of paid for that, and there were some problems with land scripts as well. But he does come back, and it's very interesting because in the summer of 1884. Macdonald knows that he's back, and he considers bribing him, just kind of shut him up. And they're like, well, if he comes back, he thought maybe they should give him an appointment to the Northwest Council or maybe a Senate seat. And by the fall of 1884, he actually decides against this. So at one point, he does actually think, well, if we kind of have him in our pocket, and then he won't act against us, and we'll be able to know what the Métis are up to. So maybe we can come to some alternate kind of arrangement. And he wrote just a little quote from Macdonald: Riel would make a good detective for the government and keep the Métis in line. And in fact, it's very disappointing because one of Macdonald's top guys, Hector Langevin, he was supposed to meet with Riel in August of 1884. So the government guy out west, supposed to meet with him. He was out touring the area in general, and at the last minute decided that the 30-mile trip by cart was just too much, and he didn't go, nor did he tell the Métis. So they're kind of sitting waiting for the government guy to come. So really upset about that. And as I've said before, the historian D.N. Sprague argues that ultimately Macdonald decides not to conciliate with the Métis or Riel because he needs money to finish the railway. And if you just think back to that timetable that we talked about for the railway, August 1884, George Stephen tells the government he needs more money. January 1885, he's back again and the government refuses. March 8th, 1885, Riel declares a provisional government, this time not a legal one. And March 11th, 3 days later, Stephen tells the government that he needs more money and Macdonald gets it for him. So, you know, there does seem to be a little link there. So the month that Riel was to be tried was the same month that Stephen's given the final amount of money for finishing the CPR. And he later wrote to Macdonald and said, that mischievous crank Riel is going to have justice meted out to him. So we should probably finish there because that's a lot of stuff.
Yeah. Well, we'll continue.
We'll
continue our talk about the Northwest Rebellion in part 3.
Will do. Bye.